From The Australian, here's What's on the Front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Thursday, October 3. Australia's first treaty has hit a huge legal snag. The Australian is exclusively revealing today the land council that struck a $1.3 billion settlement in Western Australia's Noongar country unethically accessed the emails of Aboriginal corporations managing the deal. That story's live right now at theaustralian.com.au. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has struggled to articulate the federal government's response to a brazen attack on Israel by Iran. In today's episode, Foreign Editor Greg Sheridan unpicks the government incoherence surrounding conflict in the Middle East. It was an unbelievable moment in an extraordinary conflict. In May, the International Criminal Court put out arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant.
The ICC prosecutor said he believes the Israeli Prime Minister and the Defence Minister bear criminal responsibility for a number of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Gaza Strip.
The backlash was swift and brutal, from the United States President Joe Biden.
Whatever these warrants may imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas.
And from Netanyahu himself.
What a travesty of justice, what a disgrace. And I assure you of one thing, this attempt will utterly fail.
But Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and by extension the Labor government, took a softer approach.
Well, I don't comment on court processes in Australia, let alone court processes globally, of which Australia is not a party.
Do you agree with Joe Biden?
And the appraisal of opposition leader Peter Dutton was unforgiving.
I don't know why the Prime Minister is not showing leadership in relation to anti-Semitism, and he's tarnishing and damaging our international relationships with like-minded nations when he's not strong enough to stand up alongside President Biden.
It's a moment that demonstrates how the government talks, or doesn't talk, about conflict in the Middle East.
I think the Albanese government has simply failed absolutely, comprehensively and in every dimension on every aspect of this crisis.
Greg Sheridan is The Australian's foreign editor.
They've just shown themselves to be completely out of their depth in it. It's a provincial, local, left-wing government which is simply completely all at sea with this issue in the Middle East. They don't have the imagination, they don't have the instincts, they don't have the knowledge, frankly, to deal with it, and they certainly don't have the courage. As I've sometimes said about the Albanese government, it lacks the courage of its convictions, it lacks even the courage of its lack of convictions.
On Tuesday night, Iran launched hundreds of rockets at Israel in retaliation for the death of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and a ground incursion of southern Lebanon by Israel. But as Israel and Iran traded threats of reprisal, the Australian PM talked in circles.
But we, of course, condemn Iran's actions. We once again reiterate the call that we've made along with the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Italy, Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, other nations as well, calling for a de-escalation. We're very concerned about Iran's actions, which is why we condemn them.
Pressed on whether the Australian government would support Israel's efforts to disable Hezbollah's infrastructure, Albanese ducked and weaved.
Well, we regard Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation, as we regard Hamas as a terrorist organisation. We have been working with like-minded countries and issuing appropriate statements such as the ones that I referred to.
In a radio appearance later on Wednesday morning, the PM pushed again for a ceasefire.
That statement said, diplomacy, however, cannot succeed amid an escalation of this conflict. And tragically,
you keep
what
using
we've
the words
seen,
escalation and conflict. Like, it's a war, isn't it? Like, how much escalation does there need to be for it to be a war?
well, it certainly is I don't want to get into a definitional argument. What you have is...
It's a stark contrast with the unwavering support of Israel by US President Joe Biden.
Make no mistake, the United States is fully supportive of Israel.
And again, Peter Dutton went on the offensive, accusing Labor of walking away from long-standing bipartisanship on issues of foreign policy.
I just think every reasonable Australian at the moment is looking to their Prime Minister for leadership, and what they're seeing is weakness. It seems to me that the Prime Minister and Penny Wong at the moment are making decisions that are of political benefit to them domestically, but which are not in our national interest. And I think they should stand condemned.
Well, as this matter has unfolded, the government has been both flat-footed and cowardly and incoherent. Now, when Israel began to strike back against Hezbollah, Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong said two contradictory things. They said Israel has the right to defend itself against Hezbollah, but then they opposed every single specific action that Israel took. They've been unsympathetic to the Australian Jewish community, and Albanese and Wong say Israel has a right to defend itself, but won't even support the Americans who say Israel certainly has a right to remove the Hezbollah infrastructure on its border. De-escalation, in the way that Albanese and Wong talk about it, implies that military conflict is like a bad storm or something. It's a bad weather pattern that has come up, and everyone of goodwill must just do their best to stop it. But on one side of this conflict, proscribed, barbaric terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, and one of the most repressive states on earth, Iran, which is also rightly described as the chief state sponsor of terrorism around the world. And on the other side is a long-standing ally and friend of Australia, the Middle East's only democracy, Israel. And it's as if they make no moral distinction between those two sides. On other occasions, they do clearly say that Israel is a democracy and is a friend of Australia. But when they're talking about the conflict, they effectively make no distinction. And that's extremely disturbing. And it means that they have really abandoned Israel as a government. The opposition has continued the traditional Australian position of solidarity with Israel.
Since October 7, Labor has been consistent on one thing. That's Israel's right to defend itself. The question is how.
Australian foreign policy is extremely incoherent on this matter. Australia has signed up to a lot of resolutions demanding that Israel withdraw from the so-called occupied territories. But there's no practical measure of what is supposed to happen. If they just withdrew, Hamas would run Gaza, and probably Hamas would quite quickly run the West Bank as well. The Albanese's demand of the Israeli government is completely unrealistic. It then furthermore criticises every single thing that Israel does in its own self-defence. And now the Albanese government wants an immediate ceasefire. But what is Israel supposed to do? Is it supposed to simply endure endless rocket attacks from Hezbollah? And is it supposed to allow Hezbollah to build up forces on its border, which it could use for October 7 style massacres, which Hezbollah itself has declared it intends to do? Now, you don't get anything coherent out of the Albanese government because what you're really getting from them is performative, symbolic local politics, which leads you to the final point, really, which is that the world itself is in a kind of a crisis of recrudescent anti-Semitism. And you would think a civilised social democratic party like the Labor Party would put at the very top of its rhetorical agenda fighting that anti-Semitism. Instead of which, while the government obviously is not anti-Semitic, it does almost nothing to fight anti-Semitism.
Coming up, how Labor's moves on the world stage play back at home. On Saturday, Foreign Minister Penny Wong addressed the United Nations General Assembly in New York.
More conflict than any time since World War II. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, Yemen, Gaza, and now Lebanon. Brutal.
In that speech, she called for a clear timeline for recognition of Palestinian statehood.
Because a two-state solution is the only hope of breaking the endless cycle of violence, the only hope to see a secure and prosperous future for both peoples.
Wong's speech was another divergence from the US and our other Western allies on how this conflict might be resolved. The question now is how it plays for both sides in the run-up to a federal election, which some suspect could happen in March.
I think the Albanese government could well be miscalculating on the politics of all this. The character of this debate almost seems reminiscent to me of what happened with The Voice. The Labor Party is chasing a certain activist minority, scared that its competitors on the left will capture the support of this activist minority. But I think the majority of Australians can work out when there's terrorists on one side of an argument and a democracy on the other side, they're in favour of the democracy. The other thing is people can see the incoherence and they can see the political cowardice. And whatever your position is, you wouldn't be satisfied with the federal government because it doesn't have the courage or even really the intellectual capability of mounting a serious, coherent position about the Middle East. When you are afflicted with a complete lack of influence and no feel for a subject, the last thing you want to be doing is making dogmatic statements about it. But that's what the government has been doing for the tawdry political reasons that I outline. And its cynicism and its feebleness, I think, are clear to people. And therefore, it might even damage the government with the electorate, even among those parts of the electorate which don't care much about the Middle East.
Greg Sheridan is the Australian's foreign editor. Our reporters are on the ground in Israel as this Middle Eastern conflict heats up. You can read all their updates right now at theaustralian.com.au.